Hello again, my name's Joanna Barratt and I'm going to read another chapter of my book. The chapter is entitled Watch Your Step. It's taken from Learning from Life, which is a trilogy. This is volume 2. Maurice has been dealing with the Sermon on the Mount. He's going right the way through it, and we've got to the part here where we're dealing with the verse where Jesus says, "You've heard it said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery." So I'm going to read a précis of a sermon which Maurice spoke. We need to know what adultery means in the Bible. It's not a married or single man taking an unmarried woman outside of marriage. Adultery is a man, married or single, taking another man's wife. In the law of God, adultery is actually a sin of stealing and carries with it the death penalty. God considers it to be that serious. Adultery happens the same way as all sins. First we see, then desire enters our subconscious thought, our heart. Lust in the heart isn't as bad as the physical act of adultery in the flesh, but it's the root. Sometimes it gets no further than this, but if left to dwell there, it is easy to start to fantasize. You consider the options and the possibilities. If it doesn't stop there, it leads to physical contact and the ultimate sin. Jesus says, if your eye offends you, pluck it out. You don't have to be so drastic. You can deal with some things yourself. Get rid of the filthy magazines and newspapers that are full of scandal. Stop watching the television. Change your job if it's giving you sexual problems. This will have the same effect. Stop looking, then the desires will be less of a problem. The Bible talks about spiritual adultery, which is when we say we love God and then go lusting after something or someone else as well. James chapter 4 verse 4 says, spiritual adultery makes you the enemy of God. Can God's enemies go to heaven? This is where the Pharisees fell. They were outwardly righteous, yet inwardly loved the world. A long time ago, about 30 years ago, a good friend of Maurice's and mine went through a traumatic experience. A young boy who had left school and come to work for him, whom our friend had personally trained for some years to become a very competent studio sound recording engineer, had in fact run off with our friend's wife. Our friend had been devastated by what had happened, as he hadn't foreseen the situation occurring. It seemed that Maurice and I were there at the right time to help this man in his distress, and we gave him as much comfort and support as we possibly could, which resulted in our friend becoming a Christian. You know, it's easy to point fingers, isn't it? His wife was obviously the guilty party. She'd been flattered by the attentions of a man 14 years her junior, and it had completely gone to her head. But was it really entirely her fault? As our friend poured out his story, it seemed very apparent that he'd been completely absorbed in his work and had been arriving home very late every evening. His heavy drinking had made his manner obnoxious, and he'd been without consideration for anybody else's feeling on any matter at all. Although his wife was working in partnership with him, she always made sure that she was there to take care of their 2 children when they returned home from school. And when this young employee began to take notice of her and treat her as a woman, it completely bowled her over. As a single person, as I was then, my romantic notions were that you met somebody, you fell in love, you got married, and then lived happily ever after. Personal experience had shown me that life is not like this. So many people find the first few months of marriage, known as the adjustment period, just too much to handle. And unless much effort is applied here, lovers can soon become enemies and part company. On finding out that I was pregnant for the first time, life seemed to take on a whole new meaning. It was so exciting to view the future as a family rather than a couple. And I felt as though this child would be the fulfillment of all my dreams. Stark reality soon brought me down to earth. Before I was married, although I'd been extremely busy with my various activities, I'd always managed to have plenty of time for myself. I'd lived a very disciplined life, and I'd spent at least 2 hours in prayer before going out to work each morning. I was totally unprepared for the effect that one little child could have on my life. Initially, I'd been very grateful that my child had taken so easily to breastfeeding, as many mothers experience difficulties in this area. But I must confess that being woken up 6 or 7 times each night became very wearing. And a simple thing like a shopping trip became a major ordeal, as without fail I'd have to nip to the supermarket loo to feed my very hungry baby. Because Nathan demanded so much milk, my body produced abundantly, which I found extremely embarrassing, as invariably my clothing would become very wet and sodden no matter how many precautions I'd taken. Because feeding, winding and changing Nathan's nappies took up so much of my day, I had to learn to turn a blind eye to many things which at one time I'd felt were very important. Meals, well, they were often late or burned, as I was constantly tired. As I was bonding with my child, I became aware of a distance creeping in between myself and my husband. Before Nathan was born, Maurice and I had worked very closely in the ministry. We'd travelled the world together in our capacity as ministers and had spent many hours sharing the revelation that God had given to us individually. I found it unbelievable that one child could almost ruin our communication, and yet that's what actually happened. So many times we'd begin to get engrossed in conversation, and then the baby would cry and demand attention. And because my mind had been diverted, Maurice would withdraw himself and get back to his work. As the child grew, the problem seemed to become worse, because then, instead of crying for attention, he'd come up with this perpetual chatter and not give us a minute's peace. And the more children God gives you, the rowdier your house can become. Well, quite apart from all this change in the household, there was also a dramatic change taking place in the mother. From the very outset of pregnancy, the hormones go crazy. Often, women have unreasonable cravings for certain foods at unreasonable times, and they can become very emotional. Not only is there turmoil inside, there are also external changes which have to be coped with. I was very often amazed and amused at the way my body swelled as the weeks went by. But I must confess, I wasn't so amused at the way my body slowly contracted afterwards. My bulges and curves had now been totally redistributed, which left me feeling very self-conscious and undesirable. This too, it can place a terrible strain on a marriage. Well, God was very good to us at Barratt Ministries, and for a number of years, a very dear friend and ministry partner had living quarters at our premises. This meant that he was always there with a ready listening ear whenever Maurice couldn't get through to me. In this way, Maurice was still able to share his revelation and get godly feedback in the process. You know, not many men are blessed with such a godly fallback. And because of this, Christian men can sometimes seek companionship with other women, as their needs for friendship is so great. Unfortunately, this can lead to unhealthy relationships and ultimately marriage breakup. At first, I felt very put out that Maurice had found an alternative and would continually nag him for not spending more time with me. The upheavals that had gone on in my life caused me to indulge in real self-pity. These children, whom I once looked upon as the fulfillment of dreams, were now, in some measure, resented because they had ruined so many areas of my life. I no longer had freedom, personal time, or companionship with my husband. But even through all my anxiety, God began to speak to me and tell me to have patience. And then it would be time for me to pick up the call again. Once this revelation from God had sunk into my spirit, I began to realize how good God had been to me by providing our friend to be a fallback for Maurice. Many men are not so fortunate. Well, 2.5 years after my second son's birth, my hormones finally righted themselves and I could see definite physical changes. I also noted a difference in my mental and emotional attitudes, becoming more aware of myself as a woman rather than a milk-producing machine. And this, I believe, is the point where women are at the most vulnerable. Just after finding this new awareness of myself, I was paying for my goods at the local supermarket when the cashier told me that the security guard behind me, and she pointed to a man who was at that point just behind me and began to blush. She was saying that he thought I was very beautiful and would really appreciate it if I'd say hello to him. Well, in my amazed confusion, I turned and said a quick hello, and then I rushed out of the shop as fast as I could, feeling very embarrassed but also very flattered. On later visits, I was asked for telephone numbers, etc. Well, after my initial feelings of flattery, I soon realised how hideous Satan was in the way he preys upon unsuspecting females. After all, I walked around with my 2 small children. I wore wedding rings on my fingers to make everyone aware that I was taken. It seems that no sooner do you reach the state of mind where you can resume your intimate relationships with your husband, that the devil steps in with counterfeit alternatives. It's pretty reasonable he should do this, you know, as one of his major priorities in society is breaking up marriages and families. And he'll pay more attention to the destruction of Christian households because this ruins the church's testimony. But hallelujah, God had already stepped in first. And at the beginning of that very year, God had asked me what I wanted to do with my future. He reminded me first of all of what he'd said to me during the struggles of my first year of motherhood, which were the circumstances are not important, but the call is. And the challenge he gave me with my first child was repeated with the second, as he asked if I was prepared to pick up the call again. I'd already made my decision. To me, there was no alternative. And I knew deep down in my heart that if God wanted me to fulfill his purposes in my life, then he'd make a way for me. I'd already discussed my decisions with Maurice, and this unity of purpose made a tremendous difference to our relationship. A few months after the incident in the supermarket, Maurice arranged for us to have a holiday together and prayed that God would provide for our 2 children to be looked after. He did. When God made Adam, he himself thought that it wasn't good for man to be alone. First, he brought the animals to Adam, but Adam couldn't form the relationship he wanted with these, so God created Eve. She was a gift for Adam. She was specially designed to be a companion, a help. Don't you be kidded. Nothing should get in the way of this marital relationship, be it children, family, work. Scripture says that if the unity is not as it should be between husband and wife, then your very prayers are hindered. You leave yourself vulnerable to the devil's wicked snares. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says that the married man cares for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife, and that the married woman cares for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. I, for one, am absolutely certain that if we're not prepared to do this for our partner, then the devil will make sure that somebody else will, with or without our consent. A warning. God bless you.